It's the Hidden History Happy Hour. We're back.
Yes, it
It's a
is.
nice, crisp fall day. Well, it's actually not because we're recording this early, but I'm hoping it will be by the time you see this. Cheers, my friend.
Cheers. Good to see you. I'm back on the G-Vine French gin. What are you having?
Yeah, so proving conclusively it's still summer where Alex is. I
Correct.
am enjoying a nice Paso Robles, California red Zinfandel,
Yeah.
very reminiscent of the Portuguese Douro wines.
I'm struggling to make a connection to our stories with this booze. We've got to get better at the booze stories links, but never mind.
That's true, but I did go the extra mile because, as you'll recall, our fans voted second choice in our poll a couple weeks ago, Royal Stories, and I'm wearing as close as I have to Royal Blue.
Royal
So,
Blue. Didn't occur to me. All right.
and speaking of the Royals from
Yes.
Lessons from History, the OG, what do we got?
I'm going to tell the story of John the Blind. It's one of the first I told, and it's one of my favorites. John of Bohemia, the son of the Holy Roman Emperor, of course, the Holy Roman Empire being neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, famously, was also known as John the Blind. And John was, and I may have given this away, visually impaired. He did not let this condition, which developed in his 30s from ophthalmia. So do take your eye drops if you get conjunctivitis. He didn't let that get in the way of his empire building and army leading. And as was the way at the time, in the end, all roads led to having a fight with the English. And his particular battle was at Crécy
Rightfully so.
in 1346. It is an understatement to say that that was a bad day for the French and their allies. England's forces under Edward III and his son, the Black Prince, demonstrated the superiority of the longbow and indeed the superiority of the English fighting footmen in a comprehensive defeat of a much larger force. And by the way, after Crécy, the English successfully besieged Calais, which resulted in the Pale of Calais, territory in northern France, which was held in England by England for over 2 centuries. It had representative MPs sitting in our parliament and so forth, and some seriously good art by Rodin as a result of that siege as well. And by law, I think it's at least arguable that Calais should still be British. It was ceded to us in perpetuity in return for us giving up our claim on Aquitaine, and the French violated that treaty. So if you're listening or watching from Calais, know that we are with you in our hearts, as indeed the Queen was. Anyway, though he had by this point been blind for a decade, John of Bohemia commanded the advance guard of King Philip VI of France at Crécy. To explain, Philip of France and Edward of England disputed the succession to the French throne after the death of Charles IV. Our Edward was Charles's nephew. Philip was Charles's cousin, and it was their dispute that featured in this battle, and their dispute began the Hundred Years' War. And rarely enough in history, that's not really much of an exaggeration. It basically was a Hundred Years' War. Anyway, on hearing that the battle at Crécy went against them, John ordered two of his noblemen to tie his mount between them and ride him into battle so that he could fight against the English. And this exceptional bravery was admired by all Englishmen who saw it. I mean, we killed him, obviously, but we were seriously impressed. And such was the Black Prince's admiration for John that, at least one version of the story goes, he took John's symbol for his own. And thus it is that nigh on 700 years later, three ostrich feathers are the symbol of the Prince of Wales to this day. So when you see William out and about doing his public duties, if you see an old twopence piece in my country, you see a Welsh rugby top, and you see those three ostrich feathers, you will think of John the Blind.
Yeah, great story. I believe that's one of the very first stories in the OG, and
Yep.
one of my first ones that I enjoyed as well. That the three feathers. Now,
Mm.
suppose that William wanted to change that. Is that a thing, or is that not done?
Yeah, you wouldn't do that. You would not mess with that tradition. I think that it's a great demonstration of the respect that we had for our opponents in taking symbols like that, and it's a long-standing thing that army units wear patches which recall battles that they fought. But to wear a patch that recalls the opponent that you fought, and for out of respect for that opponent, that's much more unusual. And that's one of the reasons I like this story so much.
Chivalry may not be dead, but it's certainly in a coma. Those were the
Yeah.
days. So listen, Alex, new feature here on the Hidden
Yes.
History Happy Hour. Hidden History Happy Hour mailbag. We got a great question from one of our great fans, Janet M., who writes to us, is it my imagination that the US and UK standing shoulder to shoulder is better or more effective with a Democrat in the White House and a conservative government in Westminster? If so, anyone know why?
All
What
right,
are your
so let me
thoughts?
have first crack at answering this one. I think the best relations between the United States and my country were unarguably between Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. Now, you, for these purposes, might despise their politics, but it was unarguable that they were exceptionally close. There was that little difficulty over the Falklands in which some British people might cavil a bit about the American response, but overall, on the world stage, defeating the evil empire and so forth, marching in lockstep. Winding back or indeed forward from that is not hugely profitable for the thesis either. Blair and Bush were close. Blair was a Labour prime minister, Bush a Republican. Bush was once caught on a hot mic greeting him, "Yo, Blair," and in my country that was taken as a sign of sort of disdain. But actually, I thought it was quite, the American, down home, folksy Texan. It was quite actually a compliment. But anyway,
Yeah, well, and actually, if you got a nickname from George W. Bush, that was the highest compliment, but Yo was pretty good.
right. So yeah, no nickname. He wasn't called Turd Blossom like Karl Rove was by Bush, but they were on colloquial terms. So that doesn't conform to the theory. Winding backwards, JFK had a famously awkward relationship with the British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan. I think it was that he tried to talk about how often he had to have sex, and Macmillan was very, very sort of straight-laced and found that very awkward. Churchill got on very well with Roosevelt, so that does help this theory. But then again, they were fighting the most important battle, arguably, of civilization and of all time. And of course, FDR was president for a much longer time than your iteration of your constitution suggests he should be. So there was nothing unlawful about what he did at the time. The amendment
Yeah, yeah.
arrived afterwards. But so my instinct is there's some strength to that suggestion. Uh, David Cameron in office got on perfectly well with the American presidents of the time. Obama, of course, was somebody the world was desperate to get along with. So, I think history will be quite unkind to Obama in foreign policy terms. But at the time, the importance of what his presidency stood for in its symbolism and its achievement was unarguably something people wanted to be close to and associated with. So, thank you very much for the question. My view, jury's out, not sure. What's your take?
So, well, I have a take, but I also have a question, which I should have looked up and I didn't, which is, did T Tony Blair also overlapped with Clinton? Am I wrong or no?
Blair was 97 to
Right.
2007. So
So,
yes,
so that might be an interesting case study, right? Because
right.
Blair, a Labor prime minister, served at the same time as a Democrat, Bill Clinton, and also a Republican,
Right.
George W. Bush.
Yeah, that's a good. So I think it was kind of interesting because my view, and he had a bit longer with Bush, of course, but my view would be that he got on better with Bush than Clinton. But at the time, Blair was Clinton was a fag end presidency in which he was sorry, it's an expression in the UK there,
Yeah,
but
you better explain that.
like the end the
A
useless end of a
cigarette.
presidency, the lame duck end of a cigarette at the end of a presidency. And people tend to forget now, but the last year or two of Clinton's presidency, even after he got past all the Monica Lewinsky stuff, was sex scandals, and he was kind of a good time guy coming to the end, and Bubba wasn't exactly the kind of guy you might want to be associated with. The and indeed, Blair was rowing away from association with a guy called Richard Desmond, who was a major donor to his party, who was also a sort of soft-core pornographer. In addition to publishing mainstream newspapers and so forth, he had a string of smutty magazines that Blair sort of tried to distance himself from in live interviews. So I'm not sure the Clinton aura was particularly great for Blair. Um, Blair's administration famously said they don't do God. That was Alistair Campbell's line on the Blair government. But Blair as an individual certainly does. And and after his time in office has demonstrated more sort of activity in the public faith realm than one might have thought from that government. So I'm not sure Clinton was Blair's massive cup of tea. I don't have any direct personal insights on it, but I'm not sure that's the case.
So here's my 2 cents. First of all, Janet M., thank you so much for the question.
Mm.
Please write us at any time, everybody, and also follow us and like us and rate us highly. And there's a motorcycle outside. Apologies, but I think we've stumbled into a tentative rule that's not the one that Janet asked about. But if you look at FDR Roosevelt, and then you look at the differences, why I asked the question between Clinton, Blair, and Blair Bush
Yeah.
43, what Bush and Blair 43, sorry, Blair and Bush 43 and FDR and Churchill had in common was a common war.
Right.
And
That's very fair.
I think that's probably more determinative than the personalities.
True. Of course, we will now see who knows what will happen in your presidential election campaign. We have a Labour Prime Minister who came, whatever people think of him, will be in office, I'm pretty sure, into the next presidential term. Should it be Donald Trump, we will get to test the theory in reverse, whether it's Labour, Republican, get on well. It's clear, I think, frankly, that the British government would get on far better with a democratic administration in the United States than they would with Donald Trump. Not, and I'm revealing no secrets here
Current one,
because
you mean?
well, no, the trouble is that the current Labour administration, my government,
Yeah.
consists of a number of senior figures who have publicly said the most critical things about Donald Trump. And it's very hard, including the Foreign Secretary, and it's very hard to row back from
But
some of
that's
the
but
things
that's
they've
what I
said
mean.
about
When
him.
you say your government, you mean the Starmer government that's
Correct.
okay. So
Correct.
just one more thing on this, and again, thank you very much, Janet M. And that is if Donald Trump does win the 2024 presidential election, Alex, I will be looking at your guest room. In
Ah,
2016, you messaged me in the middle of the night and you said, "Hey, I talked to the Queen and you're all welcome back whenever you want to come." So I hope that offer's still open.
yeah, actually, these things reset with the passing of a monarch, so I'm afraid the offer has expired. You are, of course, always welcome at Chateau Dean.
Fair enough. And speaking of monarchs, what's next?
We are going to tell now the story of the Prince Imperial. And this is one of my absolute favorites from the first book that I wrote about history. It is the story of Napoleon, but not the one that people are thinking about. Louis Napoleon was the son of Napoleon III, and Napoleon III was the nephew of actual Napoleon. Um, if you're wondering why that was the third, Napoleon had a son who was called Napoleon II, who didn't live for very long. So, um, Napoleon III was the first president of France and the last emperor in that order, because you might think it was more natural to be the last emperor than the first president, but no, he'd been elected and then he couldn't get re-elected, so he seized power. And Napoleon III got the Order of the Boot pretty quickly because he led France to ignominious defeat in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, which was a 10-0 at home sort of beating. And then, therefore, Louis Napoleon, who some people called Napoleon IV, was taken by his father, Napoleon III, and his mother, and they settled in Chislehurst in Bromley. And English listeners will know, but for the benefit of international listeners and viewers, that is perhaps not the most obvious place for exiled European royalty. And their lives were sort of idling along, hoping that Bonapartism at home would prevail, and contemplating a suitably grand marriage for Louis Napoleon. Indeed, after his father's death, which came about Napoleon IV to some people, to those who wanted to restore the Bonapartes in France, called him Napoleon IV. Louis Napoleon joined the British Army. Right, so he was a very martial sort, and the French alternative was definitively not open to him at the time. The descendant of Napoleon couldn't go back and fight for France, so he joined up with the British. It would be a bold general, I suggest, who would put this young lieutenant into harm's way, given his prospects for the future. Some cast him as a potential suitor for Queen Victoria's daughter, Beatrice. And there were many people in Europe who said that, or at least there were certainly many English people who said that Europe would be better off installing him as emperor in France rather than the goings on post the fall of the Bonapartes in that country. But look, as some headstrong young men are wont to do, Louis Napoleon, the Prince Imperial, charmed the usually more sensible women around him into letting him have things his own way. His mother and Queen Victoria herself intervened to make the army allow him to see action. He wanted to go into battle. And thus, the putative future Emperor of France set off for excitement in the Zulu Wars in a lowly lieutenant's garb and got himself killed in service to the Queen Empress of India, of England and India. So we had assigned him a French speaker who was a Guernseyman named Jahil Brenton Carey, and I want to add my widow's mite to the record of history to say Carey was unjustly blamed for what I'm about to describe. So he was supposed to keep Louis Napoleon on the straight and narrow and warn him away from danger. But some people just will not be told. I mean, the lieutenant had strapped Napoleon's sword from Austerlitz to his side. I mean, this is a guy who thought destiny called, and it was all his own fault. Louis Napoleon, the Prince Imperial, rushed impatiently with a scouting party into disputed territory without waiting for the full complement of men who were due to be with him. Ostensibly, the way was clear. They were ambushed in a kraal, little camp, in which his small band had stopped whilst they were brewing coffee. And he was assegaied to death by Zulus who were bound to have firm views on British troops and possibly on European royalty, but who were unlikely to have appreciated what the skirmish in the middle of, no offense to them, nowhere meant for the future of an entire continent. So after this happened, the Zulus sent word to the British that they wouldn't have killed Louis Napoleon if they'd known who he was, which I thought was rather decent of them, given that he was there in the service of a country with which they were at war and wearing the uniform and so forth. And they stressed in their communication about this man they had killed that he had died with all his injuries to his front. He died bravely. He'd fought them to the last. Now, that notwithstanding, his funeral cortege back in Chislehurst for his burial must have been a dreadfully bleak affair. The Bonaparte household had been struck a mortal blow. His mother devastated. Queen Victoria joined the funeral procession. Later on, his mother had his body disinterred from Chislehurst and placed alongside his father's at St. Michael's Abbey in Farnborough, where they remain to this day in the rather splendid Imperial Chapel. And so if you're ever in the UK or you're going to Farnborough for the famous air show, you might visit. I suppose the sad postscript is really there were various maneuvers made by Frenchmen of different backgrounds to bring later Napoleons into play. But with the perspective we gain from time, I think we now see that the last realistic chance of a return to Bonapartism in France died with Louis Napoleon in a remote kraal in the summer of 1879. Now, what is the lesson we draw from this tale of Napoleon IV? I think it's an easy one. Sometimes, no matter how hot-blooded you are and how keen you are to get going, if those with more experience than you urge you to wait for a while, then wait.
Yeah, great story. It's funny how history doesn't rhyme, but it echoes, right? So as we record this in late August of 2024, there's a story crossing the wires. That's how old I am, crossing the wires. Of course, there are no wires anymore. In America, no idea if it's true. By the time this airs, we'll probably know if it's true or not. But supposedly, a young aide to our Senator John Fetterman, and I've never seen this happen, Alex, in 25 years of experience in and out of government, went public. She's his communications director. She went public to explain how she disagrees with Fetterman's policy on Israel.
Well, she ain't going to be in post for long.
Yes, but here's the relevant part. She said about Fetterman and our generation, I think I'm Fetterman's generation, maybe he's a little younger than me, that our generation is not nuanced enough to really understand the complexities of the Middle East as someone of her generation is. Now, at the risk of sounding like grumpy old man from Saturday Night Live, that is slightly amusing. It's also terrifying
Yeah.
because this is one of the fundamental principles of Soviet, Russian, Chinese, mullahs propaganda is and disinformation. It's not so much that they want you to believe the lie. It's that they want you to believe that there are no absolute facts and everybody gets to have their opinion about them.
Yes.
So I
And
worry.
it's also a leitmotif of many revolutionary movements to tell the young, ardent revolutionaries that they know better than all the generations that came before them. And we see some of this actually. You know, you see in the radicalized they think they're pro-Palestine, but actually they're basically pro-Hamas people in
Yes.
my country and elsewhere. You see them being told these generations before have been brainwashed into the
Oh yeah.
shame of the Holocaust means they no longer understand properly what's going on here. The Jews are really fascists now, and you see all this kind of poison poured into people who, in abstract, would say that anti-Semitism is completely wrong, that there's nuance in an argument, that they wind up, literally flying the flags of Hamas and ISIS, proscribed organizations in my country,
Yeah.
and so forth.
Mine
So
too.
it's extraordinary. Tell you what, to as we're at risk of vigorously agreeing with each other, I will lighten the mood in closing by telling you that that story that Bite Back did an amazing job of publishing my books, of turning my amateur ramblings into a professionally produced book. That story contains the only error in the entire book that is not my own. Most people, Shane, never criticize your publisher, but in the copy editing of the of Lessons from History, they took the word assegaid, he was assegaied to death, and turned it into assigned to death, which
Okay.
makes kind of sense, but is not what I said.
Okay. I promise we did not set this up. Our viewers, sorry, listeners, our viewers will have seen me while Alex was reading that story, open the book and look. And the reason is I was going to ask you what it means to be assegaid, but then when
Assigned to
I looked at the book, it said assigned.
Yeah. An
So what
assegai
is
is a
it
weapon.
here?
It's a famous Zulu's like sword. A spear, excuse me. Gosh, bloody hell, I'm gonna get myself in trouble.
Here,
It's
yeah,
like
yeah.
a spear. And
That's amazing.
the Zulus were famously good with it, Rorke's drift and so forth. And the Zulus were ferocious warriors, much
Yeah.
respected of their bravery, but they used assegais, and that just it bugs me even now. Assigned to
I
death.
really, I saw, it's so funny because I went and looked and I thought, am I being gaslit? It doesn't say what he said, right? One last thing, and then we'll let people
I
go.
gaslight you plenty, but not on that occasion.
Yeah, this is a nice, crisp little episode. So I hope you all enjoyed it. And I hope you all write in like Janet M did and support the podcast. But the one comment I have on this story for you, my friend, is when you mentioned that some people cannot be told.
Mm,
Now, I have raised, as you know, two delightful, successful, amazing women.
yeah.
And you're on the other end of that journey with your son Henry. And I will promise you, there are going to be many times in the next couple of decades when you're going to remember some people will not be told.
And I was the same, and I bet you were too.
Yep. And that's the way it is. Cheers. See
Cheers, my friend.
you next time, everybody.